Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. We'll be covering an overview of the changes between the R2V3 standard and its predecessor, the R2 2013 standard. My name is Austin Matthews. I am PJR's EHS Program Manager. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on this first slide. Excuse me. We'll cover a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll cover some of the benefits of a certification such as R2V3. We'll highlight the transition timeline expectations for clients transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3. We'll spend the majority of our time covering some of those key changes between the two standards. And we'll close with an overview of the certification process for clients who are pursuing an initial certification to R2V3 for the first time, rather than transitioning from one standard to the other. We'll close with questions. Please type them in at any point throughout the presentation, but I will be saving them for the end. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on PJR's website, as well as a copy of the slides for your reference in the future. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified companies around the globe. This is not an all-inclusive list, but this list of countries in which we have certified clients certainly gives an idea of our global presence as a certification body. Similarly, PJR is accredited to grant certifications to a wide variety of standards. Today we're talking about the R2 standards. However, we have accreditation for a variety of others. In case you have integrated systems, some of these may look familiar to you. The benefits of certification vary widely by standard, by industry, by physical location. However, we can share some general themes. The standard represents a commitment to responsible recycling and reuse of electronics. So being able to advertise that commitment through this certification is one of the primary benefits to maintaining the standard certification. Implementing and maintaining the standard requirements improves the organization's environmental health and safety performance. It also represents a framework or establishes a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. Drives improvements in management commitment and employee engagement. Can provide a competitive advantage over competitors who may not hold the same certifications. Potentially improved public image. I mentioned being able to advertise that responsible recycling, for example. In addition to giving your organization potentially a competitive edge over competitors in the bidding process, for example, there could be other financial benefits such as lower insurance premiums, again, depending on the standard, depending on the location. This would not apply to everyone. Maintaining the standard requirements can help achieve strategic objectives and stakeholder requirements. And this standard is able to be integrated with other business management systems for ease of use and integration. For clients transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3, the transition information is very important. If you want to ensure there is no lapse in certification and that you successfully go from one to the other without a period of non-certification, you'll want to get familiar with the transition timeline requirements accordingly. They can be found within Advisory 22. SERI published Advisory 22 to house those transition expectations. It's on the SERI website. PJR also created their own transition plan, which we'll get to in a moment. But ultimately, SERI's Advisory 22 is where you can find this information. If you are transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3, currently that audit has an on-site component to it. The R2V3 time must be at least 50% on site. And this is part of CIRI Advisory 22 to make sure that all of those requirements for transition, the robust auditing expectations are met. There is a staggered transition timeline in Advisory 22, and it's based on certificate expiration date. We'll talk more about that on the next couple of slides. I mentioned that PGR also has their own transition plan. It mirrors the expectations of Advisory 22 while also including a recommended deadline for your audit to take place. Sometimes the deadline for transition is a bit confusing to our clients in that they think their audit just has to be completed by that date. However, in reality, there's a lot of activities that take place post-audit, and you want to ensure that you've taken those into account when scheduling your transition audit to avoid a lapse in certification. After the audit concludes, any NCRs need to be resolved. Once they're resolved and approved by the auditor, the package goes through a technical review process to ensure all applicable requirements are met and the package is complete. And then a draft certificate is created based on the information for the client to approve, check for errors, things like that, and return before a final certificate is issued. And those processes take time, typically 6 to 8 weeks from the acceptance of the corrective action responses by the auditor. So we really need to allow enough time for these activities so you don't have a lapse in certification. To that end, we recommend your transition audit, if you're not due until the end of the transition period, take place by March 30th. A lot of our clients are going to have to transition sooner based on the staggered deadlines. So we're past this initial bullet point where we're no longer able to audit new registrations to R2 2013. Any new registrations are to the R2V3 standard at this point. Like I said, the transition requirements are based on certificate expiration date. So organizations with R2 2013 certificates expiring on or before December 31st of this year, so if it expires anywhere this calendar year, they could recertify to R2 2013 one more time if the audit was conducted by the end of the year. However, if your certificate expires after this date, you're required to transition at your recertification audit. So for clients whose certificate expires January 1st, 2022, when you're due for that recertification, even though it's still 2021, you're required to transition. So we did have some clients that fell into this category. If your certificate expires later in 2022 and you've got your recertification audit for R2 2013 scheduled in 2022, that will actually be your transition audit to R2V3. If your certificate does not expire until 2023, then you need to have your recertification audit early, and or your annual surveillance audit, whatever you're due for, will actually represent your transition audit, and we'll need to make sure it's early enough in 2023 that we can meet those deadline requirements. If you haven't already touched base with your scheduler about scheduling your transition, I highly suggest you do so that we can ensure adequate time for the overall transition deadline of June 30th, 2023. It's important to note that you don't have to transition during a recertification audit unless Advisory 22 is telling you that's when you're due. If you have your ANS 2 in 2023, that will become your transition audit. The audit time, however, is required to be equivalent to a stage 1 and stage 2, so the initial registration time. And this is, again, a requirement of R2V3, and it'll start a 3-year cycle anew. So if you are not due for a recertification audit and you have other standards, they may be out of sync at that point. You can determine whether you want to switch those to a recertification audit so everything is getting that 3-year timeline, or you can keep it as scheduled and you'll notice that disconnect, which is okay too. Again, you can talk through those questions and plan ahead with your scheduler. I put the same information in a timeline. Sometimes seeing it graphically is helpful. So we're not issuing new certifications, new registrations to R2 2013. We'll be transitioning at recertifications, moving forward for expiration dates on or after January 1st. The overall deadline to transition is June 30th, 2023. Any remaining R2 2013 certificates will become obsolete at that point. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but sometimes we are asked why a given standard might have been revised. There are a whole host of reasons and so many sources of information that were taken into consideration in the revision of R2 to yield R2V3. We know that SERI is taking into consideration some of the lessons that they've learned, feedback from a variety of sources, including the TAC, client organizations, certification bodies, things like that. It was revised to ensure it continues to reflect the diversity of this industry, which is pretty significant. Ensure it's effectively implemented across the board, across the various certification bodies, clarifying any confusing language or areas for discrepancy. And as with most standards, continue to be revised to ensure it's relevant to the markets, it's compatible with other standards, it's easy to use, it's inclusive, and it's free of ambiguity. We'll talk about the key changes at a high level before getting into a little bit more detail. And this seems like a good time to remind everyone that today's free webinar does not replace a formal SERI training. This is a free resource covering some of these requirements at a really high level, just to give our clients a sense of what those changes include, what they can expect, not a training for conducting internal audits or anything to that extent. And I would really encourage everyone to utilize the SERI website. They have a lot of information on their knowledge base, videos, Q&As, podcasts, training materials. I highly recommend getting more familiar with the standard in that capacity. But this is a great way to start, and we're happy to give you guys a snapshot or a bird's eye view of some of these requirements. The key changes in R2, I've tried to fit on a slide or two just to give you that bird's eye view, but it's really, really important to note and to stress that the intent of the standard is exactly the same. No changes have been made to the intent of the standard, which emphasizes reuse above all of the other handling methods. You'll note by looking at this screenshot of the table of contents that the structure is pretty significantly changed. We see the standard split roughly in half. We have the core requirements, and then we have process requirements, and we're going to talk about each of those. The core requirements will apply to all R2V3 certified organizations, while the appendices or the process requirements will apply as relevant given a facility's scope of activities. R2V3 has a greater emphasis on reuse, with more prescriptive requirements in the areas of data security, testing, and repair. I mentioned already that it was revised to include some clarifications and address ineffectively implemented expectations. There are no longer 13 provisions, there are now 10 core requirements, so you can see that those are changed, renamed, regrouped, and again, those will apply to everyone. Another key change in R2V3 is the creation of the R2 Equipment Categorization Document, or the REC. Some of the process requirements or the appendices, again, some will apply, some will not, require, in addition to the EHS standard requirements that were already in place for R2 2013, will now require a certified quality management system, also known as a QMS. Again, those are certain process requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. Excuse me. As I mentioned, the REC is one of the key changes, the addition of the REC. So this is a guidance document or a reference document to be used in conjunction with the standard. It's not auditable, but its use is required by the client organizations, and we'll be auditing to ensure it is utilized as required. The REC provides an outline of the R2V3 requirements for evaluating electronics and components, and this includes categorizing the equipment or components based on their condition. It specifies categories that can be utilized by the organization either identical to those found in the REC or via a cross-reference that shows how the categories in the REC correlate to the categories that the facility is already utilizing. And you can download a copy of the REC from the CRE website. I mentioned already that the process requirements or the appendices will be applied based on the scope of activities being conducted at the facility. It will not include activities performed by a downstream vendor. This will only reflect what is done at the facility organization itself. There are a lot of new or changed terminology you'll want to get familiar with. We're not going to do that today. I highly encourage you to review them so that some of the standard requirements make sense. There are some new ones such as R2 controlled stream, unrestricted stream. You'll definitely want to understand what those include. Looking at the core requirements very briefly, core requirement 1 focuses on scope. It addresses everything that is to be included in the audits and the certification audit and the certificate itself. So this includes all of the processes that are relevant, everything that's controlled, all of those core requirements, and all of the applicable process requirements. Services outside of the facility can still be related to their operations. Some examples might include off-site collection, mobile data destruction, and/or services performed at a customer's site. Those are just a couple examples. I'm sure there are more. R2 certificates will need to reflect the scope, any applicable process requirements, all legal names and legal entities associated with those certifiable activities. So as I mentioned, we've got this identification of what or everything that needs to be included. You can't be doing business under 2 names for these R2 activities and only certify 1. Core Requirement 1 also requires, new to R2V3, that R2 facilities communicate a current and ongoing list of all the locations that aren't certified to R2 but are owned and operated by the R2 facility used for electronic management. To be eligible for R2V3 certification, you can't have been identified by CRE within the last 2 years to have been fraudulently marketing or utilizing deceptive practices. So this would preclude you from pursuing R2V3 certification. No significant changes to Core Requirement 2, which focuses on the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. I did allude to that earlier. Reuse is still and continues to be the first choice. For Core Requirement 3, we're focusing on EHS requirements. R2V3 has the same prerequisite as R2 2013, where we need those certified EHS standards. We accept ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 or RIOS to satisfy that EHS requirement. And there are requirements in this section to periodically evaluate relevant hazardous exposures given the types of electronics and components managed at the site and the types of processing or scope of activities. Core Requirement 4 houses the legal and other requirements. Just as before, there's requirements to document applicable legal requirements for export, transit, and/or import to be able to demonstrate the legality of any international shipments. And for greater clarity, this applies to both electronic or components transferred by the R2 facility directly and R2 controlled streams, which include shipments made by downstream vendors. So it doesn't matter whether company A who's pursuing R2 certification is the one to directly export or sends it to a downstream vendor who then exports it. It's still within the recycling chain. It's still an R2 controlled stream. So demonstrating the legality of those exports and those international movements is still relevant to the R2V3 requirements. Core Requirement 4 talks about child and forced labor, prison labor, and specifies a non-discrimination policy to be included. It also requires, this is Core Requirement 5. So Core Requirement 5 focuses on tracking throughput. It requires summary reports for all transactions, both inbound and outbound. While they don't necessarily define in the standard what the summary report needs to include, it would make sense that this is all inbound and outbound quantities within a defined reporting period. Core Requirement 5 also requires that records be accurate, be detailed. It has some requirements for those inbound and outbound evidences. Total inventories need to be maintained below limits required to maintain conformity with any applicable legal requirements. This also extends to other requirements like the facility's closure plan. Core Requirement 5 does not allow R2 controlled streams or material with negative value to be stored for more than 1 year. There are a couple of exceptions to that, including components that have been evaluated and inventoried as test and repair, so tested for parts, to be harvested for parts because it's functioning, or it's been listed for sale and it's looking for a buyer. So there would be some instances where material would sit longer than a year, but unless it meets one of these exemptions, we should see the controls in place to make sure it's being processed and shipped out within 1 year of receipt. Another exception would be where they're being stored beyond that year-long time frame due to a lack of response for approval for an export. So say you've submitted all the necessary approval documentation or applications and you haven't heard back. You can't ship out, you can't export until you receive that go ahead, but you may exceed the year in the interim while you wait potentially. That's not to say you can submit the paperwork on day 365, but you get the idea. Core Requirement 6 covers sorting, categorization, and processing. This section is pretty significantly restructured. This is also where we see references to the REC. It requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, categorizing those materials. And it's pretty prescriptive, in nature. So you'll want to review this in detail. It requires all materials be managed and processed as an R2 controlled stream unless it meets certain specified criteria. And I do have that list here on this slide. if it's been processed and categorized by another R2V3 certified facility and given a rec category, you can utilize that rec category without retesting. If it's been processed and categorized by a non-R2V3 facility and the R2V3 facility has a documented process for evaluating and sampling those outputs to verify the results and confirm the categories given are appropriate, then that would satisfy these requirements. If it can be proven through appropriate testing or verification records that it's been sanitized and functional. So if you're able to get all of those testing records, or if you're going to test it when it arrives to be able to provide that evidence, that would suffice. And then another exception would be if it's no longer an R2 controlled stream based on the definition of the term. So it would depend on the type of material and the condition and the processing up to, until that point. But if it ceases to be an R2 controlled stream or it's been confirmed not to be an R2 controlled stream, then obviously the expectations for handling that are different beyond that point. All equipment or components have to be evaluated for data, and they need to have a corresponding status given the rec. So again, we can use that cross-reference or we can use those exact categories in the rec. Any equipment or components that might contain data need to be maintained and processed according to Core Requirement 7, which we will talk about next. This is important because it means that we're being conservative, we're being proactive. If there's a chance that it could have data, if it's a type of equipment that could store data, if we're unsure of the data sanitization status, it needs to be managed through Core Requirement 7 proactively. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused, sold, or donated per written contracts are still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7 and then Appendix E materials recovery. If they can't be reused and recycled in the typical flow of events, we're still on the hook for these given requirements. Excuse me. Core Requirement 6 includes some identification requirements for items that have been evaluated and found to be capable of reuse, with some references to the relevant appendices. There are also specific requirements for electronics or components evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream. So again, you'll want to get familiar with that term and see how the rec determines the processing from there. Unrestricted streams need to be handled separately from R2 controlled streams, and we need to be able to justify why they've been classified the way they've been classified, as well as correlate the tracking to records that have been maintained. There are specific requirements for transferring functioning products. There are labeling requirements. Although physical labels are not necessarily required, we need to be able to identify and track them. So you might be able to utilize something different like barcodes, for example. No significant changes to collectible or specialty electronics. Core Requirement 7 focuses on data security. Core Requirement 7 requires a data sanitization plan, and I want to reiterate again that all of the core requirements will apply to all R2V3 client organizations. So if your scope, if the materials that you're receiving do not typically contain data, you are still going to need to meet the requirements of Core Requirements 7 and all 10 core requirements, but you'll need this data sanitization plan even if you don't anticipate processing material with data. You need to demonstrate that the controls are in place to qualify for R2V3 certification. There's also requirements for a written data security policy, the need to assign a competent data protection representative to assess risks of theft and unauthorized access within that security program. There are requirements for different levels of security, permissions and authorizations to be granted by the data protection representative we mentioned on the last slide. There are to be written acknowledgments for those who are granted security authorizations, an incident response procedure for investigating potential or actual breaches, having a defined process to demonstrate that destruction processes are 100% effective is another requirement of Core Requirement 7. This is different from R2 2013 for sure. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor, but in the case where data sanitization or physical destruction is outsourced to a downstream vendor, there are requirements within Appendix A for vetting that downstream vendor. So again, if you're outsourcing that sanitization or that destruction, if it's not being conducted in-house, when you are vetting the downstream vendor, there are some additional requirements you'll find in Appendix A for what to check, what to be looking for. Core Requirement 7 requires an annual internal data security and sanitization audit to validate the data sanitization process, and this is to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. This would not be the same as your internal audit, nor would it be the same as your annual R2 audit. Core Requirement 7 requires a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, including any changes to downstream vendors for their material with data and any security breaches. Core Requirement 8 handles focus materials. This is where we see requirements to be able to demonstrate the recycling chain has the capability of processing the focus materials as planned. This section requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart. If you're not the end-of-life disposal facility, and this would assist in meeting Appendix A downstream recycling chain requirements. You can stop at the first R2V3 certified tier. Otherwise, you need to go all the way through final disposition if you don't have any R2V3 downstream vendors. And we're not talking R2 2013 here, we're specifically talking about R2V3 only. Alkaline batteries that do not contain mercury would be managed under Core Requirement 2, unlike in R2 2013. However, also unlike R2 2013, even circuit boards that are lead-free would be considered focus materials in R2V3. Core Requirement 9 includes facility requirements requiring indoor processing, except in instances where their outdoor operations have been appropriately assessed and controlled. It also requires indoor storage for R2 controlled streams unless they are made for outdoor use. Appropriate insurance coverage is required. And the closure plan needs to include the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under its control. There are exceptions to the requirement in R2V3 to hold financial instruments for closure costs, unlike in R2 2013. If the closure costs are less than $10,000 and the building is less than 1,000 square meters and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or material containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. So a client organization would have to meet all three of those, not one or the other, all three of those in order to justify not having a financial instrument to cover the closure costs. And this will be, the exception will not apply to the vast majority of our R2 organizations, I would expect. Core requirement 10 focuses on transport. Packaging for transport needs to be secure according to core requirement 7 and in compliance with core requirement 4 as applicable. If we're transporting data containing equipment or components, there's some additional requirements. This section also requires accurate descriptions, codes, declarations, etc. for the appropriate documentation. And we had mentioned that earlier as well. I think that was in tracking throughput. So we want to make sure the codes, the descriptions are not misleading or deceptive in nature, that they're detailed, they're accurate, things like that. So that makes up the 10 core requirements. And then we have the process requirements or the appendices in that second section of the standard. Remember, the core requirements will apply to everyone and the process requirements will apply based on your scope of activities. If you are sending electronics or components or focus materials to a downstream vendor, if you are not end of life, then Appendix A is what covers the downstream recycling chain requirements. This is your due diligence, this is your downstream flow. So unless you're end of life, you'll be seeing Appendix A. It includes focus material plan and due diligence requirements. It includes the need to track and demonstrate the recycling chain through final disposition or until the first R2V3 tier. You can register your downstream flow or your recycling chain with Siri to be able to have less tracking evidence to provide during your audit. It does require transparent communication about the recycling chain as well. I mentioned earlier that when we're talking about an R2 certified downstream vendor, we are talking about R2V3, not R2 2013. So the due diligence is greatly reduced if you have an R2V3 tier in your flow chart or your flow rather than R2 2013 or non-R2. There are additional due diligence requirements if they're not R2V3. There's also additional requirements if you're outsourcing some of the requirements rather than necessarily completing them in-house. So if you're outsourcing the data sanitization, you won't be claiming that process requirement or that appendix. It won't be reflected in your scope. However, the requirements come into play in how you verify that downstream vendor to complete those activities on your behalf. Those are some key changes between R2 2013 and R2V3. So when you're vetting those downstream vendors and prepping for your R2V3 transition audit, make sure you have closely reviewed that information. Appendix B covers data sanitization, and this could be logical sanitization, which would be like wiping with software. It could be physical sanitization, which might be shredding or degaussing. There are Traceability requirements, there are training and competency requirements, security controls. There is a prescriptive physical destruction methods table to ensure that you're selecting a methodology that meets the standard requirements. There are requirements for video recordings of physical destruction to be maintained, data sanitization software requirements, sampling. There are a whole host of requirements in Appendix B that go above and beyond the requirements of Core Requirement 7. Appendix C focuses on test and repair. You could be doing testing, you could be doing repair, or you could be doing both. If you are applying this process requirement because you're conducting testing and or repair, you'll also need a certified quality management system. So this is one of those process requirements that also requires a certified QMS. There are a number of standards that SERI is recognizing for this requirement. ISO 9001 and RIOS are two of those, but there are additional options. You can find those on the SERI website. I believe there's TL 9000, there's another ISO standard, 13 something. Those are listed on SERI's website. If you are already certified to one of those standards and can take advantage of that or utilize that rather than pursuing one of these other ones, then that would save some time for sure. Cut down on costs. Appendix C requires a written R2 reuse plan. There's specific requirements or criteria that need to be included. You can find those in Appendix C. Materials need to be processed within 1 year of receipt unless they meet one of the exception requirements. And we need to maintain test result records for all of the functions for each individual item. So it's not going to be enough to have just an overall pass-fail output for each piece of equipment. You need records or results that can be maintained to show the outputs of the functionality testing for each function of each item. Appendix D focuses on specialty electronics. So if you are certifying to Appendix D, you also are required to have Appendix C. You can't have specialty electronics for use without the test or repair option of Appendix C. And then accordingly, since Appendix C requires a certified QMS, to have Appendix D, you'll also need a certified quality management system. Appendix D includes criteria and requirements in lieu of testing when you lack that technical capability to test those specialty electronics. And this appendix would be applied in instances where specialty electronics make up a more significant percentage of your materials. I think there's a 1% rule, so you can have up to 1% specialty electronics without needing the process requirement, but if you've got a more substantial amount, then Appendix D would be applicable to your R2V3 certification. There's requirements for when specialty electronics fail. There are requirements for when they pass, and they're categorized as verified specialty electronics. There's a whole host of requirements here. I'm not going to take the time to go through them as they will not apply to everyone, but you can certainly get a sense of what this includes. Appendix E focuses on materials recovery. This is a source of some confusion. The materials recovery expects or requires robust hazard and risk assessments, industrial hygiene controls, additional monitoring. This is not an appendix or a process requirement that is going to apply to everyone. So there's some confusion about whether the types of dismantling an organization may utilize apply to the materials recovery appendix. SERI has a scope tool on their website that can be really helpful in determining how they're processed and whether this meets the requirements. So if it's destructive in nature, if there is mechanical separation, chemical, thermal, there are different types, those would certainly be materials recovery. When they are dismantled by hand, that's a little bit more gray, but it depends on the equipment they're utilizing, the reasons for the dismantling. For example, are they harvesting parts? Are they breaking it down to its components to send it down for recycling? So that scope tool can be really helpful in determining whether Appendix E applies. We don't want to misapply this appendix when there are so many additional industrial hygiene and EHS monitoring requirements that the appendix requires. Appendix E also requires pollution liability insurance, guaranteed reserves, or a government guarantee to cover potential environmental incidents. So again, requirements above and beyond the core requirements, only to be applied if the type of processing necessitates it. Appendix F is the last process requirement, and this focuses on brokering. You could be a broker without a certified location in the sense that you don't receive, store, aggregate the electronics. You simply direct the shipment from the customer to the downstream, or you could be the type of broker that takes physical possession, aggregates the material until you have enough to ship downstream. So there are two categories here. If you don't have a facility, if you're not taking physical possession, you will not need to meet those EHS requirements. You won't need to have the ISO 14001 and 45001, for example. If you take physical possession, those EHS requirements do still apply, just like for all the other R2V3 facilities. In addition, Appendix F requires a certified QMS, so whether you have a facility and take physical possession or not, you do still need that certified quality management system. As we discussed earlier, there are a variety of standards that can meet that requirement. Downstream vendors still need to be vetted per Appendix A requirements. Similarly, if you do not have a facility, if you're not taking that physical possession, I mentioned you don't need those EHS certifications. So core requirement 3 and core requirement 9 would not apply in the instance where the materials are not passing through the physical facility. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rec. It's available through the CRE website. Just to reiterate a couple high points though, this is the framework for evaluating that electronic equipment, those components, those materials, and categorizing their R2 status. Their status will change as they go through the different required processes. The categories they range from cosmetic condition, functional condition, data sanitization status. There's a whole host of categories, and again, they might change as material moves through the processes. We talked about earlier how the categories from another R2V3 facility could be utilized. And we also talked about how you can use these exact categories, or you could utilize a cross-reference to be able to use existing categorization, showing how it correlates to the rec requirements. I wanted to give an idea of some of the contents without spending a lot of time on the rec itself. There are processing requirements found in the rec. There's a table I really like and recommend getting familiar with as well. This table 1 from the rec, I've got a screenshot of it here. It's kind of like a blueprint or a flow map for what types of processing might be next, depending on the types of material we're looking at. And again, you're going to want to get familiar with those R2 controlled streams and those unrestricted streams. Take a look at the definitions, get familiar with the terminology so you know which is falling into which category and you're processing the material appropriately. You're going to need to be able to identify the status of the data. The functionality, the cosmetic condition. There are additional tables and categories, again, to be either utilized exactly or utilized via a cross-reference. So I included some of these as screenshots just to give you an idea of what it looks like if you are not familiar with it yet. A couple other things I want to mention. There's a ton of stuff with R2V3. We could talk about it all day long, but some of the highlights. There's also requirements within the code of practice that impact your audits and the associated requirements of the standard. So they're not all necessarily within the standard. Some of these requirements are within the code of practice. So really briefly, before we finish up with an overview of the registration process and some questions, before your R2V3 transition or stage 1 audit, we do a contract validation. This satisfies requirements in the code of practice for a contract review as well as for a readiness review in the case of a stage 1. This is something that we do off-site. It will be factored into your time calculation for your R2V3 audit. And we can go through that in more detail when it's time for your contract validation. There are changes to the facility structure options in R2V3, so you might see some new terminology on your certificate or categorizing your facility if you've got multiple companies or multiple locations. R2V3, the code of practice allows up to one surveillance audit to be conducted virtually, even if COVID is not a factor. This is written into the code of practice to make some of the auditing easier or lower costs. This was found to be effective enough to have, utilize this option more in the future, one of those two surveillance audits. The code of practice requires evidence of correction for NCRs within a specified time frame. The repercussion for not following this requirement is suspension. It also requires revisits for any NCRs. This includes minor or major written against the R2V3 standard. They can be virtual. They don't need to be on site if the client is a good virtual candidate, and that works for both the auditor and the client. Again, we've got specified timeframes by which the revisit and that implementation evidence needs to be verified. Otherwise, again, the repercussion is suspension. Okay, really quickly, if you're pursuing certification for the first time rather than transitioning, you'll definitely need a copy of the standard to get familiar with those requirements to be able to implement them. You'll establish your system documentation to meet the standard requirements once you have reviewed the standard. You'll then need to implement the requirements. You'll need to conduct training. You'll need to conduct your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, have your management review. You'll need to actually implement the requirements of the standard of those documents that you have identified. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. You'll also need to submit any pre-qualification information required for the contract validation activity we mentioned earlier. To pursue certification, you'll conduct a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit. If there are any nonconformities, you'll need to address those before the package can be closed, technically reviewed, and a certificate issued. I mentioned the contract validation. It is usually a quarter day to a half day. It depends on whether you're due for a stage 1 or a transition. The stage 1 audit is a primarily documentation review to make sure the framework is in place and that the organization is ready for that stage 2 audit. Any NCRs identified at stage 1 do need to be resolved before the stage 2 can even proceed. The stage 2 is an audit of the entire management system, all the shifts, all the processes that's typical of a stage 2. All of the standard requirements are going to be sampled during the stage 2. Again, if NCRs are identified, they do need to be resolved. And currently, the Code of Practice and SERI require that stage 2 audit to be on site. This is one of the types of audits that are not permitted to be conducted virtually. So the R2V3 stage 2 time will need to be entirely on site. Once you are issued a certificate, after you've closed those NCRs, after you've had your audit, after we've approved the package and you've approved the draft certificate, you're now in a 3-year audit cycle. The first 2 years are surveillance audits, annual or semi-annual, depending on your contract. Those are shorter than the stage 2. They're considered partial system audits, not necessarily sampling all of the requirements of the standard. Although between the 2 surveillance audits, we certainly cover all of the requirements. And then the 3rd year of the cycle constitutes the recertification audit. Very similar to the stage 2, it samples all of the requirements and would eventually result in the issuance of a new 3-year certificate, and the cycle starts all over again. Okay. If you have not already done so, please feel free to type your questions in the chat and we will review them now. In the meantime, I do just want to switch to my contact information. If you have technical questions about the standard, certainly SERI is the go-to resource, but if you're a client of ours and you have some questions about an upcoming audit, you can certainly reach out to me. I have my phone number and my email address on the screen. If you are a new prospective client and you're looking for some quoting information, I recommend that you contact the sales department, and I have included their phone number as well for your convenience. Let's see if we have any questions. Okay, we have a question asking about the requirement for a broker. So how does a broker institute a quality management system if they don't take possession of the electronics? So this is similar to how even though they're not taking physical possession of the equipment, they're still required to meet the due diligence requirements because the processing is essentially being outsourced, right? It's not being done in-house. They're not they don't have to do the EHS requirements because they don't have employees at their facility handling the equipment that they would be potentially getting injured, things like that, spilling, leaking, breakage, that kind of stuff. The QMS, on the other hand, relates to how the processes are being controlled. So even though they're not doing them in-house, they're still on the hook, if you will, for whether those requirements are meeting the requirements of the standard or whether those entities to which they're outsourcing the processing is meeting the requirements. So similarly, how is the broker maintaining control of those downstream vendors to ensure the processing meets the applicable requirements? Do they have communication of the applicable requirements? Do they have qualifications for the downstream vendors? Do they have communication, monitoring of whether they're meeting those requirements? Trying to think of some other examples off the top of my head. They don't need to take physical possession to qualify for that quality management system because it relates to exactly that, how they control those processes even though they're outsourcing them. If a manufacturing facility outsources parts of the process, if they don't anodize, for example, they still have controls in place to ensure that the supplier or the contractor, whatever you want to call the entity they're outsourcing to, is anodizing that equipment according to their customer specifications, and that when they get that material back from the anodizer, that it meets the quality requirements to which their customers agreed, they agreed, their processes are set up for. Hopefully that is helpful or similar enough example. I know that's not electronics, it was just the first thing that came to my mind. Thanks for your question. And I bet that there would be some discussion of that on the CIRI website as well. Again, they're doing Q&As, they're doing podcasts, they're adding information all the time. So if you have that question, it's possible that others have had that same question. You might find some information on the knowledge base on CIRI's website. And you can do a keyword search as well if you want to learn more about how some of these requirements are impacting brokers or how that QMS stuff is working out. I'll hang out for another minute, although that is the only question I see so far. Okay, well, in the meantime, thank you for attending today. If you've got your transition audit coming up, I do hope that some of this information is helpful. There are a number of changes between R2 2013 and R2V3, certainly. So you'll want to plan accordingly when scheduling your audit, when preparing your management system for that transition. We have previously recorded webinars as well. I've been offering these, I think, almost every month. So if your transition audit is a little bit further out, feel free to tune back in to a future airing of this webinar. We'll continue to keep these slides updated as we learn from conducting these R2V3 audits ourselves and getting feedback from CIRI. I'll do my best to keep these updated as we learn more. Good luck with your transition audit if it's coming up. Again, I hope this is helpful. And this is the last webinar we're doing before the holidays, so I will say happy holidays as well. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day.